Daniel, thrilled to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's phenomenal to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for accepting. And I cannot wait to talk about community building, and building a tool that builds community. Topia, as you're the co-founder. And before we get to the juicy bits, I always start with the same question as a kind of check-in. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
It's an interesting question. I would say that I'm an empowerer of facilitators in many ways. But, really anybody that's building any sort of community is facilitating. And so, I have hired people. I am building sort of a Topia community, a broader community. And there's a lot of facilitation that goes on in bringing people together and helping them to be their best selves, really, and to even understand, helping guide them through what their best self may be, and then helping find the path to get there.
That's a beautiful definition of facilitation.
Thanks. I just made it up.
Yeah, wonderful. When did you start doing that? What was the trigger or the experience that got you into this direction?
That's a good question. When I was a kid, I built video games, and I was actually kind of more of a loner, but I had a huge family. I have 60 something people on one side. I have 40 on another side. So a large family, and then went to summer camp where one side of my family just took over the camp every year. And so there was a lot of community building, facilitation within that. I was also the second oldest of all the cousins. There were something like 20 cousins. And so, I think it started there. I also, along the way, did a lot of international travel. I was a digital nomad for many years as I was building different apps and had a dev shop. And while I was on those journeys, I was part of different communities of creators, singers, yoga instructors, really brilliant facilitators who needed help figuring out what is the platform to get an international audience, to get people to come to my retreats. For example, how do I market myself? And so I was helping them do that while they were helping me understand more about the brilliance of the facilitation that they were doing. And really, that actually is the origin of Topia in many ways, is how to empower creators that are incredible facilitators, incredible performers, incredible bringer together of people and energy transmuters. And how do you, give them the tools and the power to actually create their own experiences and bring people together all over the world?
And I already have a lot of questions about that. Before going there, I would like to come back to something you just mentioned, that in summer camp, big part of your family took over the summer camp. And I think that's a very interesting part when it comes to community, where you have a core that is maybe the in-group, and then you have newcomers joining. And I think the superpower of a community builder or community facilitator is to actually build a bridge between these two and to almost dissolve these silos.
I love that.
Have you learned something from your summer camp experience that has shaped that, or maybe any other brilliant thought about this?
I think that making it really easy for people to cross those lines is pretty critical. And, another just example from my life is I moved cities pretty much every 2 years and made lots of new friend groups. Each city I went to, I made new friends. And so one of the interesting things that's happened as I've gotten older is a lot of the friends that I had from San Francisco or from New York or from LA, they moved around. They were looking for introductions. We had parties in different places. And a lot of those people that lived in different places and were different friend groups are now one unified friend group. They came to my wedding, for example, and they all met each other, and now they're friends with each other. And this is one of the things that definitely happened at camp as well. And it happens throughout life. And if you are intentional about networking your network, you wind up with something that's way stronger. I think your friend groups, all the people the stronger they are, the stronger your network is. And I think this is true for community, by the way, as well. Your community is really only as strong as the bonds between individuals. And there are a lot of different structures to community. You can have, a sort of autocratic community where, it's very top heavy and hierarchical. You can have one that's way more democratized and more like a DAO, or some of the kind of governance that we're even seeing from blockchain technologies, that are being enabled by blockchain technologies, where everybody is kind of equal and they're all connecting with each other. But at the end of the day, you don't have a community unless you have strong bonds between individuals. And so a lot of what facilitation with the community is, or at least should be, is strengthening those bonds.
Beautiful. And I think what the counterpart to these bonds are is the platform. So there must be a way for the community members to build, maintain, and strengthen these bonds. And this is by ways of communication or interaction, which leads us directly to the topic, right? The platform that you build. And circling back to what you shared before is about what it means to build community and to bring people together. To what extent, or what were the challenges for you to do this online?
Well, so doing this online, the reason for it, so first, the purpose really is to bring accessibility, right? So when you think about a community, one of the challenges with building community is the constraints around and the challenges of actually physically bringing people together. And so what you saw 50 years ago is that your community was very localized, was very geographically constrained to the people that were within traveling distance of you. And over time now we have more international communities. But if you look at something like Burning Man as an example, Burning Man is a huge community in theory, that should be very diverse and should be people from all over the world. But what actually ends up happening is it's very expensive. It's very challenging to get to Burning Man, and it costs thousands of dollars and you have to fly there. And so it winds up being actually kind of an elitist community of San Francisco tech people and then some people from over the world. But, because of the challenge of actually accessing this group, it's kind of constrained. And so one of the goals for us was to say, well, can we make it so that Burning Man, as an example, can have a community of people all over the world, all different socioeconomic backgrounds, really remove the constraints, the physical distance constraints of being part of this community, make it so that any community can truly be international, truly be global, and be incredibly diverse with people from all over the world and all different backgrounds, experiences. And so, I think when we're looking into the future of community, another really important aspect is that just having a group of people talking to each other asynchronously online, so like a Facebook group or an email news thread, an email thread, that's not real human connection. And so the bonds, again, the strengthening the bonds between individuals, it's really hard to do that. Even a Zoom call, you're not really having people intersect with each other. It's more of a broadcast. It's more somebody that's facilitating, speaking to everybody, maybe calling on people, but they're not having that kind of serendipity that's quite important, I think, within real communities. And really good facilitators, what it comes down to is that a lot of these digital platforms, you need really good facilitators to make it work. And if you have those, amazing, right? But it's really challenging to self-facilitate on a 100-person Zoom call, for example. Yeah. And so the power, the importance of a facilitator is huge in this digital medium. And what we're trying to do is give that power to facilitators, but also kind of democratize it, make it so that, as an example, if you're in a digital space and the facilitator leaves for 10 minutes, people are able to continue on with the mission, which has actually happened in Topia in a couple of instances. So I'll pause there, but yeah, it's my thoughts.
Yeah, I had this kind of moment like, what? We can create serendipity and these encounters in a Zoom call by creating breakout rooms and stuff. Absolutely. But you're right. You need to know how to use the tool. And I think what it boils down is structure, to give structure to a place where you have constraints, but you also have an abundance of possibilities. And I'm intrigued by what you said about Facebook only asynchronous interaction doesn't make community. And I was about to say yes, yes, yes. And I was like, is this actually true? I believe it is true. Maybe we can, I think we can build very strong connections also in a thread through asynchronous interactions. And I'm right, it's not scalable, I think. Because you can there's only one thread at the time, and there are only that many people you can communicate with. So it doesn't create this bond and this connection. Yeah, maybe community. But it's an interesting thought.
I think that, there have been asynchronous communities where bonds between people are incredibly strong. And we've heard about, I know about this anecdotally. I've experienced it firsthand even, where, you're part of a large forum and you say something, somebody responds, you then maybe even start a side thread with that person, or you have a bunch of interactions with them. And you do kind of get each other, and you build a bond, you build a friendship, a relationship with that person. That can happen with multiple people. I think that's one layer of connection, right? So the async connection you might have with somebody can be really strong, but it's sort of it's just one face of a cube. And synchronous, looking each other in the eyes, that's how we evolved to have real connection with each other. And so these async connections it's not that they're not real, they're just one layer, and there are many other layers that you can have. So what we actually find a lot within Topia, within sort of synchronous metaverse platforms that are emerging, is that many communities are actually using async forums, and they're using these synchronous experiences. And that's great. That's actually what I would say is the optimal way to organize a community. Just synchronous also can be a little bit confusing and miss the layer of async chat, right?
Yes, and I think if you can then combine it with what you meant with this serendipitous encounters, that you meet someone in a space without having scheduled the meeting. I think this kind of space in between is where the magic happens. And so it's never done before. So the community that I'm building, we also started with a Slack channel and a few workshops, and then realized a Slack channel is not enough to build these connections. And being in the two extremes, either fully together in a workshop, too much structure, or very loose in a Slack channel, too little structure. So we built the community platform, and then realized that still it isn't enough. So we went on Velo, not on Topia, but I think the purpose is similar. And what I would be curious about is to explore a bit the edges of structure, because I think building a world, so you can get lost in worlds, right? And you can embark in a world and be very lonely, and you can be Robinson Crusoe. And if nobody is exploring this world with you, you might have to draw a face on a balloon, right? So what is your experience with using the space to facilitate itself, but also being in the space to facilitate actually the community that you want to create, host, nurture?
Yeah, you're bringing up a really important point here, which is that synchronous spaces can actually be very challenging to feel that there's critical mass of community. It can be very lonely. In an async space, you write something, you don't expect somebody to reply immediately anyways, right? So it gives people more flexibility. It gives, it's easier to collaborate in some ways asynchronously than trying to bring people together synchronously. And people know this anecdotally. Anybody that's a video game player, especially in older platforms where you're trying to play multiplayer and it's synchronous, and it took a really long time to even find a good match, and you're just sort of sitting in the lobby, and that exemplifies how challenging it can be to bring people together at the same time in an experience. And so I think the role of the facilitator, then, one of the roles, there are a few of them. One is to create the space. And, you can create the space in a way that helps people sort of self-facilitate within groups when they come in there, and doesn't actually require your presence. But then the second, even more important, is to actually create events within persistent spaces. Just having a persistent space even if you have a gigantic community and people are coming in, often people don't really know what to do, right? The role of the facilitator is still so critical, so important. And in Topia, we actually call these people confluencers. And they're, in the real world, a confluence is where a few different rivers come together and become one river. And so in a social context, we use the word confluencer to be somebody that brings together people and turns them into a community. And that really is the role of the facilitator. And the facilitators through much of recent history, at least, have been very underappreciated from my perspective. And another word for a facilitator would be an organizer, right? Bringing people together, organizing whatever the event is. Everybody has the friend or two that are really good at this. They just like bring everybody together. They plan all this stuff. They schedule everything, and they're very unsung heroes, right? And so part of the platform really for us is, how do we empower these confluencers, facilitators to create these spaces and then have critical mass of people actually coming in? Because to your point, having a persistent space where somebody's going to come in by themselves, that doesn't really build community. That might be interesting for them to go on a journey by themselves through this video game-esque like world. And that's fine if that's your purpose. But there are a lot of different mechanisms for creating the kind of critical mass, like closing your world, throwing events, encouraging people. Every day at 5 p.m. we have a happy hour in here, and there's going to be some sort of facilitation, right? Those kinds of things. Actually planning the synchronous event can be really important.
Yeah, it feels as if it needs two things: structure and permission. So structure being the logistic, the scheduling, the guidance of when is the space open and when is it closed, and having the space in the first place. And then permission is to use it and how to use it. Because as you said, even if people go in at the same time, I have the impression it's maybe a little bit easier to go and speak to someone in the virtual world than in the physical, but it depends what type you are. And still we struggle. So I think, and that's where the facilitation comes in, right? How can you make these encounters less awkward? How can you give permission and a reason for these people to speak? And then I think creating the space around a shared purpose. So who are the people that you are going to meet there? And what do you share also, that you have something to break the ice in the first place, or to be curious about?
Very interesting. It's interesting that you use the word permission, because we actually have a permissioning system, which the purpose of which is really for you as a community leader to empower other people from your community to also have permission to be facilitators, right? And so you're removing yourself as the blocker from the connection that being made, and empowering others. And this is actually a really critical thing within community as well, is, at least in my experience, is not just having one person be the single entity that has all the permission and the power and can bring everybody together. That sounds ridiculous even saying it out loud. And the reason is that, empowering your community to have leadership and ownership of the community and to be facilitators can be a really critical part of building and scaling a community. And of course, all communities have different structures, but I think that also is an important part of bringing people together synchronously, is it not always requiring a single person, not a single point of failure, but having other people have the empowerment and the knowledge, right? Learn from you, to be able to teach them how to do this. And then they have the permission to actually do it. And now you can have multiple connection points and, can be really powerful and scalable.
Super interesting. And okay, I have two thoughts at the same time. That's difficult because I totally agree. And the reason why I agree is because I sense that community is something that creates a sense of belonging. So everyone who is part of a community and an engaged part of the community is searching for this belonging. And I think we enhance it by making it our own. So bringing our full self, our own creativity and being into the space. So by enabling others to bring themselves, then the community will really get stronger. And the parallel thought to that was the very first communities we had were religious communities. And I have the impression that at the moment, especially since Corona, the lockdown, the pandemic, that online communities are almost like the new religion, where we're looking for belonging, shared purpose, shared beliefs and value systems, and even a kind of shared temple, which is then the Topia world. But these first communities were very centralized in terms of power.
Yeah. The first communities were also very centralized in terms of geographic location and proximity. Everybody was very close, very homogenous, right? They were all the same people, mostly. And, you know, I think what we're seeing now is not that, right? We're, these international, you could call them religions, you know, religious communities are made up of people from all over the place. It's not, you know, if I create a community right now, it's not going to be, and it's online, it's not going to just be people in LA that are tech entrepreneurs, probably.
What a waste of opportunity.
and so I actually think that, you know, when you have a really homogenous, geographically close in proximity group, it can be, the leadership structure can be very top-down hierarchical. I think it's more challenging to do that with an international audience, people with very diverse experiences and perspectives, because there is no one size fits all anymore. And we don't have a perfectly shared language where we've all experienced the same things and we all have the same ancestors. And, you know, when you have diversity, you actually need diversity of thought and diversity of leadership. And so, you know, it has changed, I believe, from the structures that were necessary back in the day. Now, that's not to say that, you know, again, it's not one size fits all. There definitely are international communities that are very top down, particularly when you have a single person like influencers, for example. An influencers community often is driven from the top. But I think, you know, even platforms like Reddit, as an example, you see a subreddit dedicated to an influencer. It's not the influencer that's controlling what's happening in that subreddit. They have mods, right? And even the mod structures, you know, have multiple layers in most cases with different permissions, different powers. There's mobility. There's an opportunity as just like a normal community member to be elevated into a position of being a moderator, being a community leader. And I think that that's actually going to be one of the things that people demand going forward with communities is that upward mobility within the community, because if they're investing their time and their energy in it, they want to be able to, you know, be a facilitator as they gain more knowledge and more experience around the topic.
To shape it. Yeah. How do you go about rules or best practices of how to interact in an online world, in a metaverse? Because if we're bringing in a diverse group of people, as you said, there are no more necessarily shared norms, values, even understanding of how we behave, what's normal, what's not. How did you, or what's your take on creating these shared understandings on how to behave in a space that you cannot, by definition, cannot control, because it is a world that is open for everyone to enter?
It's a really good question. You know, we are mostly leaving it up to the communities themselves. We're very much a platform. We provide the tools. So we're giving as many tools as we can for that sort of moderation, facilitation, community building. We have a lot more coming in the future around this as well. But, you know, it's not really, we're not saying here's how a community needs to operate, or here's what a structure looks like. Instead, we're creating a lot of flexible systems that allow you to run your community however you think makes sense. And, you know, that can include gating worlds. Gating worlds with passwords, with NFT ownership, with passwords, and then, even gating specific events that way, giving out permissions to people. So, like we were just talking about, one of the really powerful things you can do is empower members of your community to themselves be moderators and sort of rangers, and not have it be this top-down decision, but have the community itself sort of co-create and co-organize with you, co-moderate, right? What do we want this community to be? What do we want the best practice rules to be? And what do we do when somebody breaks those rules? And what's the enforcement around that? In Topia and in many of these emerging community platforms, you can create those rules yourself and with your community, and then empower your community to actually enforce them.
Do you have best practices, or maybe an example how it totally failed?
One of the challenges can be that if there are not community members with moderation capabilities in a world, and people come in and they're acting against the agreement for the community, then that can be a really tricky situation. And so we've run into some, consent issues or safety issues. And we built a lot of our feature systems to be very consent oriented. You can't just follow somebody. They have to ask you to follow them, as an example. And we have a lot of features like that. And we're trying to build safer spaces. But again, it's up to people, and people are human, and people do weird things. One of the things that we have found is that the whole troll culture that exists, especially in asynchronous platforms, where people are kind of hiding anonymously behind a username and acting, ridiculously, they do that a lot less when they're together synchronously in person and it's another actual human. But we're running into the same issues that the internet has in general. We empower communities, but it's up to communities to govern themselves in many ways, right? And so, the issues we've had around that are when a community doesn't govern itself at all. They just create a world, they put it in their Facebook group, and they say, use this however you want. That can be challenging. And, it's a little bit like creating a space. And to your point around having some sort of hierarchy or some kind of governance, it is important to have that, because otherwise it's like creating a big community space and just saying, hey, everybody can just come in here and do anything they want whenever they want. In the real world, that can lead to problems as well. And so you see the same kind of things in synchronous worlds.
Yeah, I was just thinking of having this huge kind of party space or hall, or even open the doors to your house. Say, it's a party space, here's a bunch of chips. Do whatever you want to do to have a good time, and then see what happens, right? Most probably it's going to be destroyed in no time. Or maybe, depending on who's entering, they're going to self-organize and something beautiful will emerge.
Bingo. So it just completely depends on your community is the actual answer.
Yes, and who you invite into the space.
Yep.
And how you invite them into the space. So I would be curious from the perspective of someone who built the tool, what have you built into the tool that actually facilitates the experience of a community being in this world together? Because, for instance, what I'm thinking of is, as you mentioned, the following. So in Topia, you really have to walk through the space. So it takes time, which was surprising for me using it the first time, because I was like, no, I want to double click there. I'm already late and now I have to kind of follow the slow avatar. And I would be really curious about your thoughts. Why is this like that? And what else have you consciously built into it?
So our goal has been to enable people to customize the worlds pretty much endlessly. And a lot of what we're building is more customization, more capability. The example you gave of sort of walking from point to point and not being able to just double click, that's sort of the default mode. That's if you're going from one point to another, and it really fosters serendipity, because that the in between, you said the phrase in between, the in between time, I think you're referring to at the beginning of this conversation. But the in between space within a space, you think about the real world, it's walking from one speaker to the next, that you run into people and have serendipity and actually network and meet people and have, you know, these wild encounters, unexpected, unplanned. And so that maintaining that parallel from the real world was important for us. We also have teleport capabilities, right? So you can build into any asset in the world, teleporters to any other spot. And so if a world builder wants to create a bunch of teleports right at the spawn location to different events and give people the choice, you can either walk there or you can teleport right there, then that's up to the world builder and up to the community organizers, essentially. And so that's just an example of how we've tried to build the tool set for you to have this base experience and then customize it to have superpowers within your world, and really to hone the experience for your visitors to be whatever it is that you can imagine. And, you know, one of the things we like to say is that Topia worlds are really only limited by your imagination. And what we actually, and that's a funny, you know, it's a fun phrase to say, but what we're actually saying there is that we tried to build our tool set to be as flexible as possible, so that anything you can imagine, you really can do. And that's where we're going with this platform. And so, you know, when you think about what we're doing versus what others in the space are doing, you know, we all have these sort of synchronous capabilities. We have different features as well, but for Topia, it's about really deep customization of the experience that you're trying to bring people into.
Mm. And I love what you're saying about the serendipity that actually happens on your way to a specific spot. And I'm just thinking, so funny. When I'm arriving at an event and I have the impression, oh, I'm late, I need to be there, I want to teleport myself. Although when I'm walking there, I might meet other people who are also late. And that's an opportunity for a really strong connection, because we have at least one thing in common already, right? And a shared experience. And for me, that's innate facilitation built into the tool. So you facilitate that by adding constraints of the slow movement. And then I was lucky enough to be in a session facilitated by Jimbo Clark, who connected us. And he made the walking to the first spot actually a kind of check-in, where you would pass by different fireside conversations with invitations to connect and share with someone who is just waiting or sitting or walking by. So I like that.
Absolutely. And you can do that with people sitting there. You can also embed content into different assets on that journey. And so what a lot of people do is actually build sort of walkways that are tutorials or explanations of what you're going to experience. And as you're going, you hit one video after another that pop up that are spatial. So, you getting near this asset, a new video pops up and explains the next part of it. You keep walking, another video pops up, and then everybody that's around you is listening to the same videos at the same time as well. And so, you can actually have that camaraderie with others that are not even just on a walking journey, but on a learning journey with you on your way to wherever you're going.
And the association I immediately have is a kind of art gallery space where you can watch someone's art and then connect with others around that art, or even present your entire business as a walkable space where you don't have websites anymore, but you walk through the content.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is another way to think about Topia, is as an enhancement or a replacement for a traditional website, because you can embed all the same kind of content. You can embed other websites within assets, clickable links, and you can portal between worlds, which are kind of like links between pages. And instead of it being just sort of a static, lonely experience looking at a website, in a Topia world, you can have all that same content, but it's a social experience. It's a journey through the content with other people.
What do you think are the minimum requirements for someone to facilitate in such a space? So if someone is just starting out, what would you recommend them to do?
It's an interesting question. I think the world's sort of empower some facilitation on their own, like you pointed out, with serendipity, with being able to just break into small groups organically. One of the things with something like a Zoom is you need a facilitator to know how to manage breakout rooms, right? And to put people into breakout rooms. In Topia, you just move your little avatar around by clicking. And whenever you're near people, you're connecting to them, and people can easily just form their own small groups and talk. So you don't need a facilitator to know how to use breakout rooms, quote unquote, because in Topia, there are no breakout rooms. You self-facilitate yourself into those groups. But I would say, one of the important things with spatial environments in general is understanding how to use the spatial nature to your advantage. And it can be a little bit tricky at first, but as an example, creating different spheres or different areas for people to go into, depending on what experience they want to have. So if you want to talk about X, go into this circle. If you want to talk about Y, go into this circle. And maybe they're private zones, so they're not overlapping with each other in their spatial connection, or maybe they're just physically separated. And that's a basic way of facilitating conversation between people. And then you can go on broadcast, you bring everybody back, and maybe have people speak up and say, here's what I learned, the kind of thing that you see where in real life, where people, here's the topic we're going to discuss. If you want to talk about this or this, here are the areas you go to, then everybody comes back together. What did you learn? You can easily do that kind of thing. And that's sort of a V1 of facilitation in Topia. Let people self-organize into essentially a breakout room within the same space, then bring everybody back together, then give them another couple topics, send them back to new circles. Another one that's pretty easy is just having a line and saying, if you're into snowboarding, go to the left. If you're into skiing, go to the right. And then people sort of self-organize into whichever one they prefer. And then they can have, they can laugh about it. They can talk amongst themselves about it. So that's always a really, and then come back together. Here's another one. That's a really fun little facilitator activity as well. There's a lot of examples like that that are unique to spatial environments in a way that would never actually make sense in something like Zoom, for example.
True.
But think about the kinds of things you do in real life. You can do a lot of those in a spatial environment.
Mm. And then it's interesting how it constrains then in a different way. So for instance, I love facilitating structured workshops on Zoom just because it makes it so efficient. I click on a button and people are in a breakout room and they're random and it's the Zoom gods that decide. And when I want them to be back, they're all back. I mean, it sounds very dictatorial, but it's very efficient. Whereas in the real world, nobody comes back. You don't do 5-minute breakouts unless you say, turn to your neighbor and share something, because it will take them 5 minutes to come back because they're going to grab a coffee and go to the toilet, and then they meet someone else and have a little conversation, right? So everything takes longer. And I get this similar sense from the Topia world, where it's more for the unhurried conversations that have a very clear purpose and structure beforehand, because you have to build the space, and then leaves a lot of space in between for things to emerge. Whereas on Zoom, for instance, I can be much more nimble, for instance, about the exercise that I'm doing, because I can change them on the spot and I don't have to build a world around it. But then there's less opportunity for emergence.
I think the reality is that there are different platforms and different tools for different activities, and that's great. And you can embed Zoom experiences. What a lot of people do is they use Topia as sort of the lobby, as the community space. And then for a highly structured experience or facilitation where Zoom is actually a better tool, you can embed Zoom within a Topia world, and they can just be hanging out there, and okay, now everybody go into the Zoom facilitation and everybody will go there. And then once you're done with that, you come back to the Topia world, and you can even then do another Zoom breakout. You could have, a bunch of different Zooms embedded throughout the world and allow people to then enter into structured Zoom environments from the Topia world. And you can use other tools that way as well. And we're very encouraging, we don't have sharp elbows. We love the idea of Topia being sort of the lobby, the meeting place, the community space, and then entering into very specifically crafted experiences. And there's going to be a lot more of these as we go forward into the future as well, not just Zoom, but other tools to help structure different types of experiences. And that's great.
Absolutely. And I love you pointing out the lobby character. When the first year I started Never Done Before as a festival, it was in 2020. And I'm not sure, maybe Topia was just started. And I was dreaming of exactly that lobby. So for me, the big challenge of having an online conference or festival was, okay, you have this amazing experience in a workshop, and then suddenly you're back in your living room all by yourself, and all the magic is gone, and it feels even more lonely, right, than before, because now you're conscious. So we had one Zoom channel, which was the lobby. It turned out to be a huge mess, but actually a kind of happy mess, because people were dropping in and out, and then we created some breakout rooms for them to have private conversations. But yeah, now I'm very happy that there are tools that actually do that job and facilitate I almost said lobbying.
It's right. And, that's actually part of the origin of Topia as it is right now. There was a group called Immersive Verse at the beginning of the pandemic. First of all, Topia was originally a VR platform, and my plan was to build it over the 2020s and have it be a platform for creators to co-create experiences together. And when the pandemic hit, I basically threw all of that out and restarted as a browser-based to make it way more accessible. Realizing like people actually need this right now. And one of the examples of that was this experience called Immersive Verse, which was thrown by some friends of mine. And it was a series of Zoom experiences, let's say 8 different Zoom experiences that were heavily facilitated. But in between those Zoom experiences, there was nowhere to go. There was nothing to do. And there was a lobby like what you're talking about of 50 to 100 people at once. And it was a disaster. It's one person at a time is talking. There's no serendipity. There's no, meeting people randomly and having side conversations in small groups. And we realized that there was an opportunity to create that was really needed for these kinds of experiences. And so for the next Immersive Verse, so I built this in basically 3 weeks of version 1 of it. And we became the lobby of the next Immersive Verse. And that was our first event essentially. And it was amazing. And they embedded all of those 8 different Zoom experiences in the Topia world itself. So you walk from Zoom experience to a Zoom experience and you have serendipity and you're hanging out with people and you're having little small group conversations. You're just hanging out in the lobby for a while because you kind of need a break from the Zoom intense facilitated experience. And so a lot of people used it then that way, and a lot of people are using it that way now. And I think that's a fantastic use case of Topia.
Very inspiring. Which brings me to the 2 more questions. That's what we're here for, right? The size of the space, because how would you guide someone for the perfect size of a space, knowing that if it's too large, you get lost? Same as an offline event, right? If it's too large, you get lost. If it's too small, it's just too crowded and busy and you feel overwhelmed and you leave because you cannot have a private conversation.
Great. Good question. Yeah, Topia worlds actually can be essentially infinitely sized. We just tested this the other day. We made a 200,000 pixel by 200,000 pixel space, and it was just gigantic. It was ridiculous. We put like 3,000 bots in the world, and as you're walking around, you still didn't even see another bot. So that's way too big of a space. But what it enables is essentially cities, like worlds that are cities down the road where you teleport between different areas. For now, or not even for now, in general, you want density. You want density and an ability to escape, like you were talking about, having small group chats. What normally is a good idea is to create a relatively small space that's bigger, that sort of has like the ability to walk off to the sides and make the main focal point be something relatively small. So people are drawn to that area, but then have the ability to move off, and even having tables on the side that make it very clear that if you want, you can come have a small group chat over here. Right here are the chairs around the main event for people to go off and essentially, make their own little breakout rooms. You can also, we have something called private zones, which you are actually even more like breakout rooms, where you can gate how many people can go into a private zone at once. You can actually do it by a guest list. You can do it by NFT ownership, password, those kinds of things. Email, somebody's email, and we have some of those features being developed to make private zones even more useful. But that can be another way to create basically these zones that people know that they can go into if they want to self-facilitate into a breakout. But in terms of world size, if you're having a couple hundred people in there, something like a 5,000 by 5,000 world, and these are pixels, that's pretty standard. If you're having a really large event like thousands of people, then 20,000 by 20,000, which is the max that we let people set. Anything beyond that is just too big, and we can manually set it. If somebody was going to bring like 50,000 people into a world simultaneously, concurrently, we can make an even bigger world, but it's exceedingly rare that anybody is able to bring together that many people at once.
I'd be curious what topic it would be. Or maybe it's just Tim Robbins.
Yeah. Usually those would be like a concert, or Coachella in Topia. But even Burning Man, we had something like 25,000 visitors. We never had that many at once.
Yeah, because then if it's global, everyone joins in their time zone anyway.
Exactly.
And related to that, what are the tech obstacles? We talked about the accessibility of an on-site event like Burning Man, which became quite elitist because it's so expensive. How easy, and with Zoom, sometimes you do have the struggles of bandwidth, and especially with other online tools, they struggle even more. Zoom is actually one of the most stable ones. So how heavy is Topia, and how accessible is it actually also for lower bandwidth countries?
Yeah, good question. So, we suffer from the same problems that everybody else suffers from. I would say in terms of, our worlds are pretty packed. There's a lot going on in them, but we've made gigantic strides even in the last 6 months around performance and stability and reliability. And we have a lot more coming along that. So we've architected our whole system to be really scalable. And even though it seems like there's a lot going on, we've done some really interesting things around our rendering that makes it so that it's actually not very heavy. It's not that CPU intensive. That being said, though, there are some issues potentially with really old devices with really low bandwidth. Zoom is really the gold standard for bandwidth and stability, and that's why it's used in even just really important government meetings and those sorts of things. But I think that the state of the entire industry is one where it's good enough that it works like 98% of the time. At least with Topia, we have a very high hit rate. There are some exceptions, and a lot of the times that actually has to do with old browsers not supporting WebRTC, which is web real-time communication technology that we're using. The good news with that is that every modern browser supports it, and so over time, over the next couple of years, we're really going to not see many instances of that anymore. As people upgrade and they're not using a browser from like 10 years ago. There's also been a huge surge in interest in this technology and in support and building out the protocols. And so you can think of it a little bit like the early internet, where when it was kind of in its infancy, not everything worked perfectly. And then over time, it just becomes, you take it for granted almost that everything just works. And we're entering into that period across the entire industry. And as you know, there's more focus on metaverse and real-time experiences. And so, you know, we're not actually having to build a lot of these protocols ourselves. We're just kind of all riding on the same wave of people, including us, collaborating to make this more and more viable, more and more stable, more reliable. And so, you know, but we very much are in the early days here. I think there's a huge opportunity for people to get involved, start understanding how they use these technologies, because this is here. It's not going away. It's only going to grow. And we might go through different hype cycles like we have with artificial intelligence and blockchain. And now we have metaverse. And, you know, we're going to go through waves, but we're building a ton of infrastructure, ton of stability, ton of important tools for customizing your experiences. And it's only going to get better from here.
How far do you think are we away from your initial vision of virtual reality worlds?
Well, the challenge with virtual reality worlds, there's two things. One is we don't have that much adoption of VR hardware. I don't know if you have any VR headsets. Most people don't, right? And so if you're creating virtual reality worlds, the whole point really of what we were talking about at the beginning here was enhancing accessibility to communities, making it so that a globally diverse group can come together from anywhere in the world, any kind of experience, any kind of socioeconomic. We're just not there with VR. It's very expensive still. Most people don't have it. Even most people that can afford it don't have it. And so the real answer is that it's going to track with VR hardware adoption and things like Topia. You know, we can very easily render our worlds in virtual reality as well. And you're going to have cross compatibility between VR, browser-based, native. But for us, it's just not that important yet because there's not really adoption of the hardware, and it doesn't make a huge difference. We actually don't want it to be overwhelming and challenging for people or limiting. And so, you know, we haven't focused on that. The other really important thing with VR is that you can't see people because they have a headset on. So there is no, you know, in Topia, one of the really powerful things is being able to look into each other's eyes. And you can't do that with current VR hardware. Now, down the road, you're going to have more augmented reality hybrid systems where maybe you can see the person's face, even though they're wearing some sort of goggles. Like if they were glasses and you had a camera or something, then you'll be able to do those sorts of things. And so it'll be interesting to see how the hardware evolves and what kind of experiences, what kind of human connection that facilitates. I don't think that just avatar to avatar connection really cuts it. It's not actually emulating that real life experience. You don't really know the person. They can be like a gigantic fish or something. And, you know, that's fun and that's cool, but it's not that human.
Yes. And you just pointed out a huge kind of blind spot. Yes, the eye-to-eye contact, that is not possible, because I was wondering when would be the year that the Never Done Before Festival will be VR based or mostly VR based. And I have zero kind of sense for that. On the one hand, I'm like, oh, I want to put it on my list to actually wrap my head around it. But as you also pointed out, I don't know anyone who has VR glasses. So I was curious. And now I actually have a good reason for waiting longer, because I think the eye-to-eye, the looking into and we're working so much with silence, with just creating this kind of human connection beyond words level. And yeah, that's a good one. Another thing you mentioned, and that I actually wrote down, I have a list now, just not to keep, to lose track of all these ideas and questions that pop up in my mind. So I have NFTs, I have visual, and I have overwhelm on my list. And you just mentioned overwhelm. And I can imagine that it's, and there's issues of overwhelm on two different levels. One for you as a builder of a tool, with I can only imagine you have a backlog that could keep you busy for the next 5 years without adding any new idea. So how to remove overwhelm for the users of your platform, and as the users of the platform to avoid overwhelm to those using the platform, because there's just so much.
Yep. That's a really important question, and one that we're struggling with right now. I would say, you know, how do you get people into something that's so new, that's actually quite a different behavior than they're ever used to? And what we tend to find is that people that have played video games, this is very easy, very intuitive. They're like, oh yeah, I get it. Their mind is blown. They're like, yeah, I've been playing games. This is almost like a game, but it's a hybrid of a game and Zoom. So I kind of get it. For people that are not gamers at all, it can be a little bit overwhelming. What we typically recommend is building a world where when they enter in, there's not a ton of stuff going on, right? So they come into a calm space. Maybe there's a facilitator, there's somebody that can kind of talk to them, or a video that automatically plays that's spatial, that kind of walks them through it, that gives them a little tutorial and explains it. But not just like dumping them right into the middle of the conference where there's panelists and there's people, and that can be really overwhelming. Typically you want like your spawn to actually be away from the horde, the group of people, the actual community space, and then make this journey that we were talking about. That journey, the walking, is an opportunity to actually warm them up and talk about the different experiences that they're going to have here. And so what we really encourage our world builders and our facilitators to do is to think about what that onboarding to your community journey looks like in a spatial context. And that, you know, it's a tall order. It's not easy figuring out how to construct these worlds in a way where, you know, where it's going to be easy and not overwhelming for people is one of the challenges for world builders right now. But you know, the good news is that once somebody has experienced something like Topia once, they kind of get it, and then you know they can use any platform like this. And so we're very much in the early days of these things, but more and more, it's a little bit like in the early days of Zoom or pre-pandemic even. You know, think 10 years ago, Zoom was incredibly overwhelming. Right now, everybody uses Zoom, and it's easy. It's nothing, right? And so the same kind of thing is happening in spatial environments, in real-time worlds. And, you know, it's kind of like, you know, we're all onboarding into this concept, but as we do, it gets easier and easier. And, you know, my 95-year-old grandfather had his birthday party in Topia, and it was a little bit overwhelming at first, and then he got it, and then it was easy. And he's just clicking, and he's moving around. He's talking to everybody. He's having a great time. And, so, you know, we find that it can take people like 10 minutes to adjust the first time they ever do it. It can be helped by World Builder building some sort of tutorial into the world and bring them on a journey. And then once they get it, then the next time they come, it's a piece of cake.
Yes. And as you mentioned, with every tool we're adding to our toolbox, the adoption of the next one is easier. And it actually, what you explained also links into my next topic, which is visual. Because when you refer to the size of the perfect size of the world, you mentioned to center it around, to make it clear where the group is supposed to center and to hang out, and where to spread. And you mentioned tables or private areas. And what it brought to my mind is that and I learned this from, I think it was Shane Smart, who also came on the podcast, to use clues that we know from the real world and include them in our digital design. So, if there is a bench with two seats, okay, I'm supposed to have a conversation here. If there is a fireside, I'm supposed to have a slowed down conversation, right? And if there's a disco bulb, maybe something fun activity will take place here. So what kind of visual, how easy is it for someone who's not a visual thinker to actually build that world and to use your tools? To have can I imagine that you have a gallery of assets that I can just drag and drop into the world?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so we have a whole library of assets. We have hundreds of assets in there. We also have a gallery of scenes, which are a collection of assets in a particular order that make them an experience, right? So if you want like a merry-go-round experience, or you want a whole panel setup with chairs and broadcast microphones, you can just get that scene and then plop it right into your world. And we have a whole marketplace as well, where they're community built experiences, community built scenes. So you can replace your entire world with basically a template that somebody else has built, or you can use whatever, whatever you're doing, maybe even just a blank canvas, and then drop particular experiences from the marketplace or from our library into your world. And so you don't have to construct these things from scratch. There's a lot of tools. We've also tried to build a lot of visual cues into Topia itself. So for example, being able to sit, your avatar, your Topi, being able to sit really indicates to people that you're here, you're having the conversation, especially if you're sitting next to a campfire, right? And all of these things are really context, right? So the point of your avatar, the point of the scene around you is to provide context. So like you said, when there's a bench with 2 seats, that's context that facilitates it. It's part of this self-facilitation, right? Creating the world itself is part of the facilitation, where you're giving visual cues with the context of what people are supposed to do. And so thinking about it more that way, what is the functional context I'm trying to create? And less of the focus on how do I make this the most beautiful world it possibly can be. What we find often are that the more functional, context-driven approaches lead to better outcomes than just throwing a whole bunch of random things and images and visuals into a world. And so using, for example, the Topia library, using black and white assets, pencil drawn assets, there's hundreds of different assets that all are part of the context that you're creating for people around how they're supposed to interact with each other. And so thinking about it, just even sketching on a piece of paper, like, where do you want people to hang out? Okay, so I want this to be the core area, and then for them to hang out in these other areas. So maybe the core area, put like a dance floor or a panel with chairs, and you just take that from the library, throw it right there. And then in these other areas, I want to create a few different options. So I'm going to put like a table and chairs, I'll put a couple benches. And again, you just grab those from the library and put them in. But thinking about it, less of the approach of just let me just throw a whole bunch of things in here, and more of a structured, what do I want the experience to be? And then just pull in assets that make sense in that context. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. And then again, referring to how we interact in public spaces. I interviewed a public space designer and facilitator. And he also mentioned that, there's something to this, to the square, to the public square in the middle of a city. People gather there, people go there. So to have kind of a central space, which is maybe round and have stuff around it, feels so natural because we know it. Almost independent of any culture. You have the marketplace in the middle and people go to the market.
Yep.
So it's natural behavior enhanced.
Definitely. And then, another funny thing in the real world is that whenever there's a party at a house, everybody hangs out in the kitchen.
Yes.
Why is that? Right. So even just thinking about the psychology of people as they're in a space, what are the kinds of things that draw them into different areas? And these are kitchen is a context. It's not hanging out in the kitchen is not more comfortable. It's not a better place to hang out. It has drinks there, right? Or it has food. And so, or just people feel comfortable in a kitchen for some reason. So how do you emulate that in a virtual environment?
Exactly. And that's where it becomes really interesting. So if you take the food away and the drinks away, because you cannot provide that in the digital space, what is it that is left in the kitchen? And I tend to believe that even if you put the food and drinks into the living room, people would still go into the kitchen. And I tend to believe that usually it's quite a small space. Coming back to what you said initially, it must be as dense as possible with options to break out. So the kitchen is dense. And maybe because it is not very comfortable, So it is maybe the permission, oh, I just go in because I cannot sit down anyway, so I won't stay long. So if I don't like it, I have permission to leave, with the best excuse ever, there are not enough chairs. Right?
That's really interesting. It's serving as a sort of transient point, gives you safety in going there and engaging, because you can always, it's not your final, space that you're hanging out in. It's always this transition. And so, that in a digital context would be, having people, watching people sort of hang out on the journey points, right, in the in-between spaces, because it feels safe. One of the interesting things with something like Topia is that it actually can often feel very safe compared to something like a Zoom, because you can come in and out of conversations very easily. And that's one of the things people like the most. Or if they're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, they go on this sort of peripheral of the conversation, and they're not like fully in, right? Yeah, exactly. Kind of like listening. And you see that in the kitchen example that we're talking about too. Sure. People will just go stand in the kitchen. They are part of all the different conversations, even though they haven't like locked into sitting on the couch, fully invested, fully committed to being here for this conversation. And so I think that you actually do see a lot of that in a virtual, the sort of like proverbial kitchen safety. You do see a lot of that in a virtual spatial world as well.
Yeah. What we tried to experiment with was the toilet queue. So there are fantastic conversations in an offline space where you're just standing in line, and the only reason why you're all in the space together is because you have the same urgent natural need. But then I realized that just putting a literal toilet kind of icon in the space kind of attracts some curiosity, but hasn't made the full deal yet. So there must be something else around it.
I love that. It's true.
Yeah. So again, as you mentioned, creating context so that the visitors know what kind of conversational interaction they can expect in that particular space. So kind of a framing, priming. There surely is a psychological term for that.
Well, I think also, creativity actually often is best with constraints. So being told, here's the container, now be creative, fill up that space within the container, as opposed to there is no container, do anything, talk about anything, have any context. That can actually be, it's like when somebody asks you to just tell them a story. Tell me a story. Like a story about what, right? What are the constraints on the story? That makes it much easier for me to respond with something. And I think that that's true for all of these contexts as well, is giving the container, giving the constraints that actually help people be really creative and connected within that space.
So would this mean that a world that fails in terms of building community or hosting community or facilitating community would be a world without constraints, where everything is possible and then suddenly nothing is possible?
That's interesting. You should bring that up. One of the challenges has been one of the worlds where there is no structure at all, and it's just a big open space. For example, if you just have a blank white canvas, people get a little bit confused about what they're supposed to do, right? What am I supposed to be talking about? What am I supposed to be doing? Where am I supposed to go? What's the purpose? What's the point? People want to understand what the purpose and point is. And often you find in galas, for example, that you'll have a purpose even going into it, right? People like to have that purpose, and they like to be told, even through somebody coming on the microphone and explaining, here's what you're going to do tonight. Here's your goal. Here's everybody's mission, right? And so, even just drawing from the gaming world, like what's people's quest? What's their mission with this space, with these interactions? That can be really important. And if you give no constraints and no guidance, maybe there's serendipity, but more likely you're going to find people just confused and bored and not really sure what to talk to each other about.
Yes. And I was just reminded by what I read in Brené Brown's book about emotions. And One of them was curiosity. And what I learned, I wasn't aware of it, that curiosity needs a bit of information. So if I'm walking into a black canvas space and there are other people, what do I need in order to be curious about these people is a little bit of information of what brought them here. So what is our shared purpose? And then, because otherwise, when I take all my courage and I walk to this person to start a conversation, what am I supposed to say? So there's a lot of pressure. But if we're taking this away by creating context, or just, creating a purpose, this makes
well, and this brings us actually back to what we were talking about before around what makes a community. And a community really is a group of people that have a shared belief, shared interests, shared beliefs. If you think about the origin of civilization in the first place, and even religious communities, religious groups, religious beliefs that allow people to coordinate and be on the same team and have a shared language and form larger and larger groups because we all have the same purpose. And even thinking about like nation states and nationalism, it's all about having shared purpose, having a shared vision, shared interests, beliefs,
identity.
And so identity. And so that becomes really important, even in a small group environment where you're just trying to have people hang out and talk to each other. What part of facilitation is telling people what are the shared interests that we have, right? Give me something for us to connect on, and a shared purpose, a shared sense of identity, so that we have a constraint where we understand where we can even start and really help facilitate that initial connection, and then provide some guardrails around what are we likely to find interesting in each other? What are some of these shared beliefs we might have?
As far as I know, it's not possible yet to individualize your avatar on Topia, right?
Correct.
Because I was thinking that this can be a nice trigger as well to show parts of your identity through your avatar. And I love to host parties, but I'm not particularly part of a group. So usually when I host a party, I invite all my friends and they're all one-on-one friends. And then I hope that they will become friends, similar to what you explained initially. And one way how I facilitated that in the past was to invite them to wear a t-shirt that would tell a story about themselves. So that when they meet each other, they don't have to ask, so what's your name and how do you know Miriam? Which would end up with kind of a boring conversation, but instead becoming curious in each other. Oh, why are you wearing this t-shirt? Thereby bringing forth an individual story. So yeah, having an individualized avatar.
Yep. So what we did instead, and we'll likely have individualized, customizable avatars at some point. We wanted to make it so that the Topias right now are sort of androgynous. They're gender non-specific. They're race non-specific. They're just they're kind of context or embodiment of yourself in this world, so you can actually navigate it, but it's not the focal point, right? You as a human is the focal point. That being said, we did release emote systems, so you can throw into the sky sort of like flare different images, and those indicate membership, belonging. So I don't know if you've seen the emotes yet, but we have a membership system coming very soon where you're going to enable people to join your community, either through paying, a subscription to it, or just by entering a password, clicking on a link. There's a bunch of different ways that people can become members of your community. And one of the things that will unlock is access to different emotes, so that when you're in a space with other people can throw sort of like their community indications and their interests into the air, and then you can see other people, what they're sort of indicating that they're interested in talking about, right? And then you can go up to their avatar and talk about that. And if you're in a big group, like you're at a music festival, you can see people that are part of your same community because they have the same emotes.
Facilitate finding your tribe.
Exactly.
Love that. And do you have I need to ask this question, then hopefully I have time for one bonus question, which goes into an entirely different direction, but I'm still curious. Do you have a favorite exercise on Topia?
Favorite exercise on Topia? I think the thing that I find just always delivers fun is the game that I was kind of talking about before, where you have a group and you can actually embed this in a video player, or you can just use a YouTube. There's a bunch of these that basically says, X or Y, right? Are you into ice cream cone or ice cream cup? And then have people, self-organize into the sides. And then it's always really funny because then you realize you have these shared interests with these people, and you have like a little 2-minute interaction, and people are talking about their different things, even self-organizing into smaller groups within the side, and then coming back and doing the next one. And it can be a great way to learn about people in a way that's really hard to do. And I've never done this in real life, but I think it would be really fun in person also. So I'd say that's my favorite. There's also my second would be scavenger hunts. So you can create really interactive, immersive scavenger hunts in Topia, and those can be really fun to go with a group of 4 or 5 other people, and you're trying to find the clues, trying to find the next point, and traveling on your bikes or walking. I have a lot of fun with that as well.
So many ideas. Do you have time for a bonus question?
Yes, let's do it.
Oh, if you hear my question, you will regret your answer. You mentioned NFTs, and with the very little knowledge I have, so these are tokens, so like a currency, with the difference that they are unique, right? So you can hand out tokens for membership, and you said that you could, for instance, allow coming into a world regarding if someone has a token, so can identify as a member of a certain community. What is the opportunity of, and what one thing that I recently learned about is that you can hand out tokens for participation, for instance, in certain activities. So you can collect a wallet of tokens of joining different events, different workshops, and these kind of things. Where do you see the opportunity of NFTs for the world of online community builders or online educators even?
Yeah, so NFTs are really all they are entries in a database, and blockchain is just public databases. They're decentralized databases. So in the old days, 6 years ago, every database is centralized. It's owned by a company for the most part. There's some exceptions, but it's centralized to a company. Every entry is controlled by that company. And so the company doesn't need to trust anybody else. They're just making entries. They trust themselves. They're making entries. And then if you're a user, you're coming in, you're accessing their centralized closed database to retrieve your connections, your friends, your creations, your community membership, whatever it might be that's being stored in that private, centralized, closed database. With blockchains, what we basically have is the emergence of public databases, where the entire world is collaborating to make entries. And the function of a blockchain, the whole point of the technology, is to make it trustless, where people can self-organize and make these entries into a public database in a way that is safe, where the entries are preserved, where they're immutable, where they can't be changed after the fact, and where it continues on into the future. So it's a collaboration technology for people to have public databases. Now, NFTs are non-fungible, so they're unique collector items, essentially unique entries into this database for unique objects. And so one of the ways this becomes really interesting for community facilitators, community builders, is that the idea of a public database the really interesting thing about it is that you can create something once in this public database, and then it's up to every platform to make use of this creation. So for creators, rather than needing to go to every single centralized closed database company or product and create something different for each one, now you get to create once in a public database and have all the platforms make use of your creation. The same can be said for communities, right? So historically, you had to go to each community platform. Think about Facebook and then Instagram and any other community platform. You have to create a new community in each of these platforms. They don't go between the walled garden of this centralized database. In a public database, you can create your community once and bring it with you everywhere. And so NFTs are essentially a ticket. One of the ways to use NFTs is that it's a ticket and access to this community. And then within Topia, within any other application that has integration into this public database, you can bring your community with you, right? And you can say, if you have this NFT, you can get access to this world. And by having this NFT, you also get access to the Discord channel, and you get access to to 100 other applications and utility layers for my community. So that's one of the ways to think about it. And we're just in the infancy. It's a big valuation hype cycle. It's probably going to come down, but the core technology, the core premise of having public databases where you can create your community and bring it with you everywhere, create art and other creations, and have them be useful across the entire ecosystem. That's really powerful. It's very creator centric. It's very community centric. And in the long run, it's better for creators and community organizers because you only have to maintain one truthiness and you can bring it with you everywhere. And because it's better, that's where everybody's ultimately going to gravitate.
Thank you for that. And what I hear is, so at the moment, what we do as community builders or even online business builders is we have to collect email addresses. And then, so they have basically to sign up, and then we have to trust so many systems that what we're creating is actually reaching them. And if I understand it correctly, the NFT is actually switching this around. So you get an NFT and then it's independent of your email. So it's not that you need to chase these individuals, but they can come to you because they have the key, they have the NFT, and then only need to know where they can plug it into.
Now, the downside of NFTs right now is that they're the top collectibles are very expensive. So basically, you have to pay a lot of money to be able to join a community, and it's actually very elitist that way. Now, in the future, this is going to change likely, or we're going to have, it's just the infancy of this technology. So you're going to have collectibles, you're going to have tickets, you're going to have a lot of different forms. Ultimately, they're just entries in a public database. And so just like any database, think about all the different possibilities. It doesn't have to be, what we're seeing right now is a massive valuation frenzy around collectibles. And that likely will continue, but that's not going to be the only thing that exists. This technology is really powerful and it's just in its beginnings.
Yeah, and they're free NFTs, like these tokens of participation. That's totally open source and free. Exactly. And it reminds me a little bit of the beginnings of the personal computer where you had DOS. And if you didn't know how to put the commands into the system, you couldn't access anything. But then you have Windows and then you have iOS. So the database is actually quite difficult to navigate if you don't have the platform to navigate it or the interface. Yeah.
That's right. And Netscape Navigator, I believe, or it was called something else early on. But the browser, the invention of the browser made the internet actually useful to normal people. And we're kind of in that era, that phase of blockchain right now, where some of the infrastructure, the critical applications, the utility layers, with Topia, we're not an NFT platform. We're a utility layer for NFTs. We've integrated into these public databases. If you're using NFTs for your community management, you can use that technology within Topia. So we're very much trying to be this utility layer, and there's lots of different companies that are doing the same kind of thing. And we're not really riding the valuation frenzy of collectibles as some other virtual platforms, virtual world platforms are. Rather, we're trying to say, look, this whole idea of public blockchain, of public databases makes a lot of sense. And there needs to be more applications. There needs to be more utility, more value inherent in owning these database entries. And so, that's what we're striving to provide, and others are as well.
I am intrigued. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience. And looking forward to seeing you on Topia.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. This has been a great conversation. Really enjoyed myself.
Thank you. Dum, da, da, dum. That's the end of the podcast jingle, and you need to run. Thank you.